Thank you very much. Thank you also for the Institute for inviting me here to Austin. It's a pleasure being here, although it will be only for a short period of time. But I will be presenting today my findings that will be published in my forthcoming book. It will be my second one, but it will be the first one published in English. My first book was published in Hebrew 3 years ago on the minorities unit in the IDF. We just discussed, me and Rami, maybe to go forward and to translate it for English reading audience because of the interest growing on such topics. So in order to put my presentation in some context of things happening in the news, for those of you who are following the news from Israel, so I decided to bring here two quotes. The first one is from Mr. Avi Gabay, the new leader of the Labour Party. And during his interviews with the media, meetings with the public throughout Israel, he has stated the following statement. "We will not share a government with the joint list, period. Let that be clear. You see their behavior. I don't see any connection between us that would allow us to be part of a government with them." So this statement is not so weird because it's very much in line with other statements that have been given by either left-wing or right-wing leaders in Israel. It has been debated at that time. It was in October 2017. And the response was coming from the leader of the joint list, member of the Knesset, Ayman Odeh, who said the following. "Someone who doesn't view Arab citizens and their elected representatives as a legitimate group does not present a real alternative to the right. Since the days of Ehud Barak, the Labour Party has strived to be a pale replica of the right, and the citizens always choose the original. To be drawn into the delegitimization campaign led by the Prime Minister against Arab citizens is a huge gift to the far-right coalition headed by Netanyahu." These two quotes, I'm using them in order to raise some of the questions that helped me shape this research. Those questions include what is the joint list, why it was formulated in the first place, how does this fit into the development of the political trends on the self-identification of Arabs living inside Israel, what is actually the status of the integration of Arab citizens within the Israeli polity, within the Israeli political system. And at the end of my book, I also write a few things about what happens next in this debate. So my presentation today will be divided into three basic or major parts. First, I will give some introduction for those of you who are not really familiar with Arab citizens within Israel. Then we will move to the main two parts. One will be focusing on the Israeli-Arab political trends, identity and leadership, and the connection between these three. And the third part would be the Arab in the political system within the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And this comes within a debate that has been happening both within the Jewish Israeli society and the Arab Israeli society. Within the Arab Israeli society, they have been asking the question, what does it mean to be part of the Israeli political system? Does it worth it to participate, to go to the polls, to have our own parties, to be in the Knesset, and so on? And this is part of a larger debate that's have been happening within the Arab society in Israel since October 2000 clashes. There has been since then some ideological boycott of the elections. I will get to that in a minute. But this debate has been facing also another debate happening within the Jewish Israeli society in which the Arabs have been even more marginalized. And this is evident throughout the debate happening in Israel in 2013, 2014, and even once again nowadays regarding the nationality bill that is being discussed now. So I will start with the first part and to try to introduce in very short minutes of what is the Arab society in Israel without going into the details, because it's not the focus of our discussion of today. The war of 1948 was a turning point in the region, in Eretz Israel / Palestine, depending on your point of view. But in regard to our topic, looking on the Arab society living in Palestine, and more specifically, looking on the Arabs that are nowadays living in Israel, 1948 was a huge turning point for them. First of all, just looking at this chart, and it's not by accident that it is cut here in half. It is totally different point of view and perspective before 1948 and after 1948. Before 1948, Arabs in the larger Eretz Israel, the land of Israel / Palestine, they were part of the majority, living in mandatory Palestine. Although this majority has been decreasing over time because of the Jewish immigration coming into Palestine, into Eretz Israel, but still they were the majority. One day, let's say it like this, one day before the 1948 war, they were about 70% of the population. Most of them are Muslim Arabs. But once the 1948 ended, the 1948 war ended, we have a new entity, Israel, a new country. Within that country, now we are talking on a minority of Arabs living in this new political system, and this new polity of some changes with the percentages, but it's after the 80s, it's stable of about 20% of the population. So this is one huge change that happened to this population, moving from being part of the majority in the Middle East, part of the majority in Palestine, and then part of a minority, an ethnic minority within Israel. The second huge change that happened to this society is that during the 30 years of mandatory Palestine, there is an increasing urbanization process. Also for Arabs, also for Jewish people, most of the immigrants did eventually live in cities, Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and so on, but also within the Muslim and Christian Arab community in Palestine. Many of them did sell their own lands to Jewish immigrants and then used the money in order to move to cities and so on. So there was also urbanization process, growing middle class, and all of these processes has not just stopped in 1948, but even were reversed afterwards. Because one of the consequences on the Arab community now nowadays in Israel is that most of the middle class, those who had the means, most of those living in cities did decide to flee the country during the war or were expelled. There are different approaches to this issue, and you can bear me this discussion of what is more than the other, because this is not the focus of our discussion for today. So that leaves those 150,000 Arabs here in Israel, mostly living in villages and not in cities. The third important issue that happened here for Arabs living in Israel is that after the 1948 war, they actually lost all of their leadership on the national level. Those who had the opportunity, once again, fled the country or were expelled, and all the other institutions either were destroyed or dysfunctioning following the results of the war. So change in the perspective of minority majority, change in the urbanization versus being living in villages, and a change that's happening within the leadership of the country, leaving actually the leadership for the traditional leadership of clans, head of extended families, and that's it, without the national level of identity. So nowadays we have these Arabs living inside Israel within the green line. This is the focus of our discussion for today. not in the Gaza Strip, not in the West Bank, but actually inside Israel as citizens of Israel. There are today about 20% of the Israel's population. It is about 1.8 million citizens. When looking at this society, we need to acknowledge that there are some differences between them in terms of their religious affiliation. So the vast majority of them, in the past decade or so, around 80% of them are Muslims. We should say Sunni Muslims. Less than 1% are from different Islamic sects. For example, about 2,000 people in northern Israel living in one village of Alevis. This is actually in dispute with Lebanon, but it's a totally different story. So 80% of them are Sunni Muslims, 10% are Christians. But when saying Christians, it doesn't mean that they belong to one specific sect, but they are divided between about 15 different churches. And we have another 8% of Druze. The story of the Druze is very much interesting, and it needs another lecture to develop of the Druze in Israel, the Druze in the Middle East, and the relations with Islamic religion and so on. But this is, once again, a totally different story. Last thing of the part of introduction on the Arabs in Israel is, as you can see here in this map, they are spread all over Israel from south to north. But basically we can say that the vast majority of them are situated in the Galilee in the north and along the Green Line. Let's see if we can see what I am showing here. No, we can't see it. Okay, so it's up there. You can see a little bit southern to Haifa along the Green Line and the Galilee. These are the basic two regions that we can find most of the Arabs. But as I said in the beginning, there are also in the Negev, mainly Bedouins, in Jerusalem, in Jaffa, in Haifa and other cities. And by saying that they are also in cities, we need to know that only 15% of Arabs in Israel are actually living in mixed cities with Jewish people. 85% of them are living in their own Arab majority villages. And when I say 85%, this is calculated only when I do not include those Arabs living in East Jerusalem. So the story of the Arabs living in East Jerusalem is also one unique, another story. They are counted as if they are part of Israel, but they actually are not full citizens of Israel. So they are residents. They can vote if they want to the Jerusalem municipality, but they do not have the right to vote for the Knesset, for example. So they do not really have full Israeli citizenship. And these amount to about 400,000 people. They actually themselves do not identify as Israelis in distinction with the others, and we will get to the same thing of identification. So this is the first part of giving you a little bit information about what is the Arab society inside Israel. And now I want to move to the second part, trying to connect political trends, identity, and leadership. When talking on an ethnic minority within a nation state, without going too much into the theoretical approaches and so on, we basically have a problem from the basics of integration. And Israel was no exception to that, having a vast majority of Jewish people and formulating the state of Israel as the state for the Jewish people. So we have a basic problem from the beginning. But this was not the only problem. Other scholars have already identified four major problems of the connection between being an Arab in Israel and what does it mean from the side of the Israeli policies. So for the first thing, it's a problem for the security. Just thinking with the minds of the Israeli leadership in its first years. Israel has been attacked by the neighboring Arab countries through the 1948 war, and it had several more wars in the following few decades. afterwards, and then you know that you have 20% of your own population that themselves are Arabs and do belong to the larger Arab community in the Middle East. So they have been seen as a threat to the country. Will they be loyal to Israel? Will they be loyal to other countries that are coming to invade or coming to fight against Israel and so on? The problem is that until today, some parts of the Israeli Jewish society, should be said, still perceive the Arabs as being a threat to the Jewish majority. The second thing is the lands. In the first few decades, Israel had confiscated hundreds of thousands of dunams that belonged previously to Arabs, and this was for the purpose of establishing military camps, but also for the purpose of establishing settlements for Jewish newcomers. In the last years, this issue has transformed not an issue of confiscating lands, but much more as a dispute between the central government and some Arab localities about planning for housing and how this should be done. So this also, second topic, is also an ongoing one and not something that has finished. Third is the socioeconomic gaps. Other scholars have already investigated this issue, so I am not adding here something new, that the services that are being provided in Arab localities do suffer from lower level if compared to Jewish localities, but also this is reflected in lower socioeconomic situation of Arabs if compared to their Jewish counterpart citizens. From all these issues, the most important one, in my point of view, is the contradiction in the identity. So Israel does identify itself as a Jewish and a democratic state. And by defining Israel as such, it basically do have a problem in having an ethnic minority of 20% of its own citizens. And it also contradicts with some of the promises that were given in the first years in the proclamation of the State of Israel and the guidelines of the first government. We will get to the identity also and the complications of it when we'll get to the identity of Arabs themselves. So in the first years, the Israeli governments did need to decide on very important things, such as the things that I have stated here, and I brought some pictures to make it much clearer to the audience. So David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, did need to decide in regard to the Arab citizens of Israel. So the debate goes like this. Israel is a democratic state, therefore it should grant full citizenship to people who are living in its own territories, meaning also the Arabs, not the Jewish people. So citizenship was granted, but then the question was, what are the implications for such a thing? Should they be allowed to vote? Should they be allowed to have representation in the government? Should they have representation in the parliament, in the judicial system, and so on? And after debating on this issue, the decision was made that if Israel wants to be considered and want to declare itself as democratic, full citizenship should be granted, at least for those who are considered as living inside Israel, those 150,000 people at that time. So citizenship was given, and then a decision was made that Arabs should be allowed to vote in the first elections in early 1949 and should have also representation. But in fact, what happened is that Arabs did get the right to vote, but their vote was controlled in the first 2 decades until the end of the military administration that was put on those Arab territories by saying it was controlled, meaning that not just that the government at large and through the military administration did control the vote and wanted more and more Arabs to vote, but also Mapai, the leading party at that time, did use the military administration to convince, let's say it like this, the Arabs to vote for specific lists, What list? It was list that the Mapai party created, and they actually chose who will be the Arab representatives, and they asked the Arabs to vote for those lists. Actually, in the Knesset, those Arab representatives at that time, they did vote as they were instructed to do so by the leading party, Mapai, at that time. So we can say that they did have the right to vote, they did have representation in the first two decades, but it was not something that we can call democratic participation and democratic representation. And this does not continue further than that. They did not have any representation in the government. In fact, the first non-Jewish Arab minister was appointed only in 2001. We will get to the names and more specifics later. And there was a debate also if Arabs should be integrated within the judicial system. The official decision was that they should, but in fact, the first Arab judge was appointed to the Supreme Court in Israel was in 1999. So decisions is one thing, but implementation on the ground was something else. Another question was the right of return. It was obvious that by declaring that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and going back to decision 181 made by the UN Security Council in dividing Palestine into two countries and one international zone, one for the Arabs and one for the Jewish people, meaning that this is obvious that a law should be passed of the right of return for any Jew who wants to come back to the land of Israel and become an Israeli citizen, that should be allowed. But there was a debate what Israel should do with those Arabs who either were expelled or fled the country within the 1948 war. Should they be allowed to come back? And that was a clear decision that Israel has no responsibility for those Arabs, and if they have fled or were expelled, never mind what was the reason, Israel should defend its own borders and not allow anyone to come back to their own lands. And therefore, we have the Palestinian refugee issues since then. Those Palestinians who are living nowadays in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and West Bank and Gaza, and were not allowed to go back to their own homes. In terms of the language, the debate was either to continue what has been already decided by the British mandatory government, and the decision was that the official languages are English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And should Israel continue the same pattern? And in order to make it easy for the Arabs in Israel, it was decided that it should be kept the same. About the language, there is a debate nowadays in the Knesset through the nationality bill and other laws that are being considered. The new law suggests that the official status of the Arabic should be downgraded and not kept at the same level as it should be as the Hebrew language. But there is still no decision. This is the reason that if you travel throughout Israel, you will see many signs in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in English. It's not something that's happening in all the signs, but in most of them, this is the situation. About Jewish symbols of the state. So there was a debate on the flag, on the emblem of the state, on the national anthem, and so on. But all the decisions at the end were left to have some kind of Jewish heritage, Jewish religion, Jewish history in each and every one of them. And this basically excludes all the Arab citizens, even those who really think that they are more Israelis than any other thing in their own self-identification. I like to give an example of myself. I was an IDF officer for 14 years. Decided to quit to try to pursue my academic career afterwards. And when I ended my military career, I was at in the position of a major, if this something makes sense to anyone. So in the military, we usually have many ceremonies. in which the national anthem is being used. So as an officer, as I identify myself as an Israeli, as an Arab, as a Druze, but when the Tikva is being sung by my colleagues, I cannot sing it. This is something that does not represent me. I cannot sing something that is related to being Jewish or aspiring to return to Zion for 2,000 years. This is not me. So I respect it, I respect the flag, I respect everything, but this is not something that represents me. So this is something of that being said by someone who identifies first of all as Israeli. So let's think about those other Arabs living in Israel who are attached to Israel, are very comfortable of being Israelis, but not to the same extent as myself or others like me. What do they think about the national anthem, on the flag, and so on? A very problematic situation. So all of these are from the government perspective, from the Jewish Israelis perspective. Now I want to move a little bit to talk on the Arab perspective inside Israel. Other scholars have already identified that the political trends, the self-identification, and the leadership has changed in Israel among the Arabs, basically in three major periods that are in line almost in most cases. So the first period is from 1948 until 1966. Why 1966? Two major events. One is the abolishing the military governance over Arab territories, and the second is 1967, the Six-Day War. So what did these two things do? One is the military administration. When it was abolished, it actually granted freedom to Arabs to move, even the basic things, to move from one part of the country to the other without asking for permission. Less control of the government on political matters, on political gatherings, and so on. And the 1967 Six-Day War actually opened the borders for them also to reconnect to their families, to their friends, to the other Palestinian side of the border, meaning that things have changed in this respect. So in this first period, they were mainly identified as Israeli Arabs from the civic perspective. They did not have any other affiliation. The Palestinian national cause was defeated in 1948, so they have not been able to attach to anything from this sense. So they were considered much more as Arabs, as Israelis, not something else. In terms of the leadership, as I mentioned in the beginning, no leadership at the national level. So it's just the traditional leadership, clan leaders, and so on. The political participation was controlled, things that I have already mentioned here. Since 1967 until the early 90s, until the first Intifada basically, when they are much more able to politically gather together and reconnect with their Palestinian national identity, so they are much more connected to that. Therefore, we are calling them much more Palestinians in this period. They are starting to formulate their own leadership on the national level. Leaders are starting to cooperate between each other. They are able to do so. So we have the formation of the Arab Mayor Committee for the first time. We have a huge protest in regard to the confiscation of lands, which is the Land Day in the 70s, the first time, and since then it's being commemorated year after year. And other institutions on the national level for Arabs that are being formulated in this period. The third period is since the Oslo Accord in the early years of the 90s. Here we are talking on a much more multidimensional identity, having together being Israelis, being Arabs, being Palestinians, all together. I'll get to that in a second in much more details. In terms of the political matters, for the first time, Arabs are formulating their own political parties, real parties with agenda, with policies that you can differentiate between each other. And Arabs here are much more voting for those kinds of parties and less for what we label as Zionist parties, all the other parties with Jewish majority and an agenda that's much more connected to Israel. So here we have a change happening in 3 periods, and I argue in my book that since October 2000, the October 2000 clashes, we are starting a new period in which things are also being shaped in different things, but I will get to that once again in a second. Here you can see some of the data that I have been talking about. It's the Arab turnout that has been very high in the first 2 decades because of the military administration control and the use of the Arabs to vote for Mapai and parties that are affiliated with that. And since then, it has been decreasing, the turnout of the Arabs, until what happened in 2015, and I will get to that, I promise, in just a few minutes. One another thing that I wanted to highlight here is the percentage of Arab vote to Arab parties. So it was about 50% only in the 70s and the 80s, meaning that they were still voting for Zionist parties at the time, for the Likud, for Avodah, Marach, that time it was the Labour Party, and so on. But since the 80s, we can see that with the existence now of Arab parties, real Arab parties with agendas, you can see that more Arabs in Israel are voting directly to those Arab parties, with the huge success that happened for them in 2015, and also we will talk about it in just a second. So regarding the identity, many scholars have been investigating the self-identification of Arabs in Israel, but the main argument that is being accepted nowadays is that Arabs in Israel have a multidimensional identity that have at least 4 parts. So the first part, not by saying first that it is really the first among the interviewees that we ask, but the first one is being an Israeli. This is something that most of our interviewees that do participate in such surveys do say that we consider ourselves as Israelis. There has been changes in how much of those Arabs do identify as Israelis. In the 80s and in the 90s, it was very high, reaching even 80% of them saying that we identify as Israelis. It was because of the hope of the Oslo Accords, from the one hand, and the other hand is the Rabin government that did invest in a 5-year plan in Arab localities. So they did see a vision for the future to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they did see a vision that their economic situation within Israel will be improved. So back then, the vast majority of them did consider themselves as Israelis. In the past 2 decades, this has been decreasing to reach between 50 to 60% of Arabs that still identify themselves as Israelis. Second is the national identity. And this is most of them without changes, let's say it like this, of most of them saying that we are Arabs, we speak Arabic, we do have some common things with Arabs living in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in other places in the region. So we have the language, we have a common history, a culture, and so on and so on. But we also identify as Palestinians to distinguish ourselves from those Arabs in Lebanon, to distinguish ourselves from those Arabs in Egypt. We are different from them. We do identify as Palestinians. Sorry. And we do see some shared vision for the future in this land. The religious identity was found to be the most important of them all. When I ask interviewees about their own identification, they basically will say, I am a Muslim, or I am a Christian, or I am a Druze. All the other identifications will come in most cases afterwards. But there is also the regional identity. People would like to say, I am from the Galilee, or I am from much more to the center of Israel, al-Muthallath, which is the triangle, or I am from the Negev, and so on. It is used as something very important to people. By saying so, it's also a political say, to differentiate between each other within the Israeli context. Let's take two examples. Arabs who live much closer to the center of Israel will love to identify as such in most cases, to say that we understand Hebrew. We use Hebrew in a daily basis. We are very close to you. Basically, if it's an Arab from the triangle or an Arab or Jewish from Tel Aviv, we have such more common things between us to differentiate himself from those from the Galilee. And actually, when I have taught in Israel in different campuses that belong to the Open University, I did notice this difference when I was sent to teach in Rahat, near Beersheba, or to teach in Qalansawa, or to teach in Sakhnin in the Galilee. The level of the understanding the Hebrew language and the level of how much people want to use the language in order to be part of something much bigger is very much different. Those in the Galilee, for example, are less, if I compare them. They do less use the Hebrew language and do want to less be identified as Israelis than others. So there's a difference also in this regard. Some other scholars that I have been talking with him about this, he also told me, also look at those Arabs who do participate in TV shows in the Hebrew media in Israel. You'll see that most of them do come from villages nearby to the center of Israel and not coming from the Galilee or the Negev. And something that should be maybe examined by following research or something like that. The other example is another political say in identification among the Druze community, in which I belong to. So there is a big difference between being a Druze from the Carmel Mountain. There are two villages. I come from one of the villages, from Dalat el-Carmel, and the nearby village is Asfiya. So this is one thing of saying I am a Druze from the Carmel, or being a Druze from the Galilee. Basically, those from the Galilee do say about us in the Carmel that those are the Ashkenazi Druze. But so they want to say about that the Druze living in Asfiya and Dalat el-Carmel are much more Israelis, much more use the Hebrew language. Most of them work in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or nearby places with a Jewish majority. But the much more important say is those Druze living in the Golan Heights. Those Druze living in the Golan Heights do not consider themselves as Israelis. They still consider themselves as Syrians. Actually, according to the 1982 law of confiscating the Golan Heights, they are allowed to apply for Israeli citizenship, but less than 5% of them did do so. And this is something that we should understand. A change is happening in the recent years following the Syrian war, civil war, and I am following the news from there. And I plan to conduct a research on the first local municipal elections that are about to be held in the 4 Druze villages in the Golan Heights for the first time in this coming November. By saying all of these, it is something that when we ask those Arab interviewees, so we get the, identify yourself, if it's an open question or a closed question, but the conclusion would be, I am a Muslim, for example, or a Christian or a Druze. I am an Israeli, I am an Arab, I am a Palestinian. But with one exception. When we ask the Druze citizens of Israel, there is no presence for the Palestinian self-identification. So they will identify as Druze, as Israelis, as Arabs, but not as Palestinians. By saying so, this is not the only thing that is different between the Druze and the other parts of the Arab society in Israel. But in order to explain that, I will need to get into much more details on the larger political map. So let's take the 2015 elections and the processes that developed to that elections. So in the 19th Knesset, following the 2013 election, there were in the Knesset 3 Arab parties. You see the names here. So it was the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, Hadash in Hebrew, the United Arab List, Ahmad Tibi, for those who are familiar with the names, and the National Democratic Assembly, which is Balad. These 3 parties did have representation in the Knesset. I did represent the Arabs. They were challenged by being small parties of 3 to 4 seats in the Knesset. That's it. And they did have competition between each other on almost the same potential voters. However, they were even more challenged following a bill that was approved during the 19th Knesset, changing the threshold to enter the Knesset from 2.5% to 3.25%, meaning that maybe only one of these parties will be able to enter the new Knesset after the 2015 elections. Some of the members of the Knesset who voted for such a new bill did say this is in order to maximize the governability by minimizing the fragmentation of the political map. But it was understood that at least part of those who voted for such a legislation did think by this we can minimize the Arab representation in the Knesset. So if you look at the agendas of those parties, you can see that they are totally different. The only 2 things that they agree upon are the following. They agree that a solution should be found for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the form of the 2-state solution. The other thing that they agree upon is that they want 100% equality for Arabs living inside Israel. However, they do not agree on the specifics of how to do it in each one of these 2 things and any other thing that you can see here. For example, this is a much more religious agenda party, while this is a much more secular. The first one is also 100% secular party, and so on and so on. You can look at this and more details in my forthcoming week. So just thinking on having those 3 parties joined together was almost impossible because they basically do not agree on basic things. But they were forced to do so, to negotiate. And an agreement was achieved only after the involvement of traditional leadership, of intellectuals, Arab intellectuals, and so on. There was actually a committee put to solve the problems, and the problems were, once again, not on agenda, but on which party will get which seat, number 5, number 6, number 12, number 13, and so on and so on. However, at the end, it was a huge success for them. By saying huge success, that means that they have increased the representation of Arabs within the Knesset. They have received 13 seats, when before that they did have for the maximum 11 seats within the Knesset. This is a chart that can help us understand how huge was their own success. The joint list, this is the name of the list that did combine all of these parties. It did receive more than 80% of the Arab vote in Israel. So this is huge. You can see the percentages for other parties from the left to the right. But when looking at this way, it doesn't tell the entire story. When I delve into the details, I get this information that says basically that there is a difference between the different religious groups within the Arab society. So most of the Muslims, 89% of the Muslims, did vote for the joint list. But only 72% of the Arab Christians. Still the vast majority, but a difference between them and the Muslims. The most important figure here is to see the Druze vote, which is less than 20% of them did vote for the joint list. So let's just make it clear. The joint list was formulated on the cause of Arab unity. And here the Druze basically says, okay, this is your unity, we are not part of it. 80% did vote for Zionist parties. Actually, when I did try to examine who were those 18% among the Druze who did vote for the joint list, I discovered that most of them came from one specific village. It's called Yarka. And now it's much more obvious because they voted for the joint list because the joint list did have as number 13 a Druze representative from Yarka. So basically they did not vote for the joint list because they believed in the voting for the joint list, but because it's their cousin, someone from their own clan, from any kinship relation that they did have with them. So this is a clear say, not just saying in interviews with pollsters like me that we identify as Israelis, we do not identify as Palestinians, but also when going to political trends and participation, this is a clear say. Now I want to move to the third part, which is what is the situation of the Arabs in the Israeli political system. We will start with the legislative. You can see here in this, these lines represent the following. The most important one is the green one. How many Arab members of the Knesset are out of the 120 members? So you see it here in percentage. In the first few decades, it was around 5% only of Arabs as members of the Knesset out of the 120. And it has been increasing since the late 80s because of the formation of Arab political parties with agenda and so on, and flocking all the Arabs to vote to such parties. So you have an increase. And the latest elections, 2015, it's actually the first time that it is reaching about 15% of the out of all the members of the Knesset, and it's very much similar to the percentage of Arab eligible voters. I explain, if it's important, you can ask me in the questions about the difference between being 20% of the population, but just 15% of the eligible voters. So a change has been happening. It has been increasing the representation, but representation in numbers is not the only factor. The question is, what are they doing there? And what are they achieving? So even if they are part of the Knesset since the first elections, 1949, Arab members of the Knesset has not been so much influential on what's happening in Israel and in the Israeli policy and Israeli government, mainly because they were not ever invited to be part of any government, but also because of the type of people who were representing them. As I said, until here, it was people who were chosen by Mapai, so that's what is not real representation. It was usually non-educated people, and things started to change since the late 80s. And actually, when I investigated the joint list, it turned to be the most educated list of representatives nowadays in the Knesset, with the highest percentage of those holding PhD, MA, and BA, if compared to any other party in the Israeli Knesset nowadays. So being more educated means that they are much more involved in what's happening. Until the 80s, other research has concluded that even most of those Arab representatives did not know the Hebrew language, did not understand how the political system works, and so on. So things have been changing since then in the positive way. I did meet recently, not recently, 1.5 years ago, with one of the Arab officials within the Israeli government, Mr. Ayman Saif. He's responsible for a specific department within the Prime Minister office, who is responsible of improving the economic situation of Arabs in Israel. And he has said to me clearly, we have the Arab members of the Knesset involved almost in any policy making that we are doing. It's being done secretly, behind the scene, because it's not for their own interest to say publicly that we are working with the government, with a right-wing government, to do such a thing. But this is happening actually on the ground. Other things that have changed in the past few years is a more involvement of Arab members of the Knesset in the Knesset work, on the floor and in committees. An Arab member of the Knesset was appointed for the first time to chair a permanent committee. It was in 2004, for 2 years, 2004, 2005. Actually, now in the current Knesset, it was the first appointment for an Arab woman to chair a permanent Knesset committee. It's member of the Knesset, Aida Touma Saliman. She is the chairperson of the Committee for the Equality of Women. As deputy of the Knesset, we had Ahmad Tibi, appointed for the 4th time in a row, and so on. Arab members of the Knesset are members of all the Knesset committees except 2, not because they are forbidden, but by decision that they do not want to be involved in the Committee of Foreign Affairs and Security, with the exception nowadays of a member of Meretz, not a member of an Arab party who is now a member. And they do not want to be members in the Knesset Committee for the absorption of Jewish immigrants. So they do not want to be. So they exchange those seats that they are eligible for with other seats in the Finance Committee and other committees that are much more important to them. So this is in the legislative. Within the executive authority, the situation is much more problematic. And here, as I already said, Arab members of the Knesset has never been invited to be part of any Israeli government. They actually say themselves, we do not want to be part of any Israeli government until, among other things, until a peace will be achieved with the Palestinians and the Palestinian state will be formulated and an equality will be achieved for the Palestinians living inside Israel. Until then, we do not want to be part of any Israeli government. But what I say is that at least they should be given a chance. Okay, come, you want to come to the negotiations? Please join us and be invited, and this has not been even done. The only 2 times in which we can say that Arab members of the Knesset did make a difference was in the Oslo Accords and in the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Yes, 2005. In the Oslo Accords, Rabin did lose the majority in the Knesset, so a vote of no confidence could have been approved, but was eliminated by some of the Arab members of the Knesset who did not vote for no confidence with the Rabin government because they saw something bigger than that happening. And they actually, in the vote for the second phase of the Oslo Accords in September 1995, 1 month before Rabin was assassinated, the vote was approved by 61 votes. And in part of those votes, some of the Arab members of the Knesset, some of them, not all of them, voted in approval of the Oslo Accords. The second time was during the term of Sharon as prime minister, when he wanted to implement the disengagement plan from Gaza. And once again, back then, he had problems with the Likud and formulated Kadima and so on. But there was a few months that it was a minority government. So basically, a no confidence could have been voted to withdraw the government. And once again, some of the Arab members of the Knesset did not help in achieving such a thing. So they did help the Sharon government to succeed those difficult months. Within the government, this time we're talking mostly on Arab members of the Knesset that are part of Zionist parties, not Arab parties. So that means the Likud, the Labour Party, and so on, Meretz, and others. And here we see only 6 deputy ministers who are non-Jewish, who were appointed throughout the Israeli history. I think that this should have been much more than that. And if you can see the religious affiliation, there is over-representation of the Druze if compared to Muslims and Christians. The same thing is if we take the list, only 3 of non-Jewish ministers have been appointed. The current one is Ayub Qara, who is the Minister of Media and Communications. He's a neighbor of mine, but I have never voted for him. But this is on the political positions. If we go deeper within the Israeli government departments and other affiliated agencies, we see actually a much more positive situation. We just have the data since 2007, calculating how many employees are within the government who are Arabs themselves. And an increase has been happening since then, because there is a plan that all the Israeli governments since then have been adopting to have tenders target specifically Arab citizens of Israel and giving them some affirmative action to be employed with two intentions. One is to have them part of the decision making, to try to influence their own localities. And the other thing is to try to, by this, improve their own socioeconomic situation. So this has been improving to about 10%. This is the way forward, and I hope to see it increasing in the coming years even more and more. Within the judicial authority, as I said in the beginning, the first appointment of an Arab to the Supreme Court was in 1999. Abdurrahman al-Zobi was appointed for a temporary position of 9 months. He was succeeded by Salim Jubran, once again for a temporary position, but then he was appointed for permanent position. He has just retired last year, 2017. But another appointment has been made since then of George Qara, and there was another candidate who just recently withdrew his candidacy and did not pursue further. I just forgot the name. I have a blackout now. I will remember in a second. So this is in the Supreme Court. Also here we can see progress happening if compared to the first 3 or 4 decades. And also we can see it within the entire judicial system. In the first 2 decades, no Arab judges within the Israeli judicial system. First 2 appointments in the 60s. And then we have an improvement happening until about 8% of the entire judicial system is made by Arab judges. It's about 52 or 53 judges nowadays of Arabs in the judicial system. There has been a research conducted on this specific issue that found that many Arab law students do not want to become judges because they know that they can make more money outside. But things are changing, and maybe in the future we will see much more. So this is in the 3 branches of power, and the last thing is within the local government. Oh, I did not want to show that, but never mind. So when I examined the situation of Arab municipalities in Israel, this time I did use my statistical analysis of multiple regression to try to identify what do cause the problem of services within these Arab localities. So the government has been claiming it's because of the local policies, of things that are being decided on the local level, corruption, and so on. Local leaders, when I approach my own mayor and say and ask him, why do not I get the same level of education for my own kids, and I need to enroll them in a school in Haifa, as the same as my parents did, why I don't get the same level of education? So he says to me, basically, it's a discrimination from the government. They do not give us enough budgets, and so on and so on. And then other scholars did find that the problem is within the socioeconomic problem of the socioeconomic level of the city for residents in these localities, something that is much more problematic to solve. And here in my research, I wanted to investigate what is much more causing the problems, and eventually I found out that it is, although there was, until the late 80s, discrimination in allocating budgets to Arab localities, this thing has been solved since the 90s, at least in the regular budgets, not in infrastructure, but at least in the regular budgets. So the services should be at least in the same level as in any Jewish locality. So the problem actually was found to be on the local level, in the local leadership and local policies that are being implemented. I want to show this picture from al-Fahim, one of the Arab cities in Israel. to emphasize what I mean by local policies and things that are decided on the ground. So here you can see the center of the city, and you can see two mosques. One on the right of Abu Ubaidah Mosque, was built by the Ighbariya clan. And on the other side is Umar ibn al-Khattab Mosque. It was built by the Mahajni clan, two rival clans in the political arena in al-Fahim. And if building a mosque is considered to be some kind of a service that is given to residents, so why build two mosques in the center of the town? Why don't build one in the center and one other in other place, just to make it easier for prayers to have this possibility? So the reason is, if one clan is building in the center, we are going to show that we are also here in the center of the town, not on the peripheries of it. And this, I think, something that makes a point in one picture of a huge research that I have conducted. Some conclusions. The 2015 elections and the formation of the joint list I consider them as a milestone and something that is going to change from here forward what is happening with the Arab society in Israel, in terms of that this is for them a say, that it is a clear identification of us as Arab Palestinians, but then within the Israeli polity, meaning that we want people to go and vote, we want people to have us represent them within the Israeli parliament, not disconnecting from that. So there are two sides for the same phenomena. And once again, it's a clear leadership that, this is a one list of representatives that they can debate together and take decisions. And that means that it is uniting most of these Arabs, specifically Christians and Muslims, excluding the Druze, on one united society. And as I have emphasized, that the Druze have segregated themselves from this unity. And the last thing that I wanted to say here is that having those Arab representatives in the Knesset representing their constituencies is not enough, but they should be given more tools to have substantive Arab representation that really can make a difference and show their own people that it is worth it to stay within the Israeli polity itself. The last thing that I wanted to show here is what does it mean, all of this, in my field of study, which is the political science, and what does it mean on the definition of Israel as a democracy. I debate that very much in my book. When it will be published, I will send here a link for those of you who will be interested in it. So I'd like to use this classification of regimes between being a liberal democracy or being an authoritarian regime, while many other regimes are in the middle of some kind of hybrid regimes or illiberal democracies. Some say that the US, Germany, France, UK, and so on are considered to be, for example, liberal democracies, while, let's say, Turkey, before the latest changes in the past few years, was considered to be a hybrid regime and is moving more and more to being authoritarian and so on. So where do we position Israel in this debate of relating the Arabs and Israel? Actually, there is many scholars that have been investigating this and many approaches. These are the four main approaches among them. Most of the Israeli scholars in political science that are investigating it do claim, as the same as Rubinstein, that Israel is a liberal democracy, as the same as the US, the UK, and other countries, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. It does have some problems, as the same thing as other countries have a problems. Don't you have a problems here in the US? Okay, we do have. Yes. On the opposite side, such as Professor Iftachel, who claims that Israel is an ethnocracy, meaning it is a democracy for Jewish people and it is an autocracy for the Arab people. And he lists 6 main things that are problematic within this context, and claiming that Israel is almost authoritarian, but not just, because Professor Iftachel do recognize that there are democratic characteristics of Israel, such as freedom of speech, fair elections, and so on. In the middle, we have other 2 scholars, Professor Neuberger and Professor Smuha. Basically, both of them says exactly the same, that Israel is not a liberal democracy. It is something more considered to be an illiberal democracy. They state some problematic things. Most of them are the same, except of these 2 and the red, and you can see that one of these problems are the inequality of Arab citizens of Israel, as stated as something that disqualifies Israel from being a democracy. But the difference between the two is the following. Professor Smuha says that this is what it is. Israel can't be 100% liberal democracy, because from the first beginning, Israel was formulated as a Jewish state, or a country for the Jewish people. So basically, if you have 20% of the population are Arabs, not Jewish, so basically you have a problem. As much as possible, you can give them equality. You will not be able to give them 100% equality. And that's okay. And here's the difference with Professor Neuberger. Professor Neuberger says almost the same thing, but he says it can be solved and should be solved. And therefore, the vision of Neuberger is trying to move Israel on becoming 100% liberal democracy. So what does this mean to my presentation here? So those scholars, such as Yiftach El and others, do say that it doesn't worth it for Arabs to participate in the political system. They do not even to go to vote, because their vote is not counted. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't worth it. This is what scholars such as Yiftach El will say about voting and representation. Scholars such as Smuha and Neuberger will say it is worth it for them to participate, but some of the things should be solved in order to integrate them much more. Those such as Rubinstein and others will say that, what's the problem? There is no problem. We are a democratic country. They want to vote, please go ahead and vote. They have representation. It's a democratic case. If they are the minority, they will be the minority. They should have the problem with their own leadership, that they do not want to be part of any Israeli government. So they put the blame on them. I find myself somewhere in between Professor Smuha and Neuberger, and I acknowledge that I accept Israel as being a Jewish state and a democratic state. I do want it to be much more democratic and give much more equality to its non-Jewish citizens as myself. But I do understand that when we look on the larger picture of Israel situated in this region of the Middle East, and to solve some of these problems, to solve it, I see it that it would be successful only if we implement the two-state solution. But when I say the two-state solution, it means that there would be a country for the Palestinians, and there would be a country for the Jewish people, and there will be some consequences on the 20% minority that are living within Israel, including myself, and this is what it is. You cannot have all the pieces of the cake and keep it as a whole, as itself. Thank you very much.